Joined by one of my StealthBits teammates, Adam Laub. He's the Senior Vice President of Product Marketing. I am always Jonathan Sander, CTO, and your host here for the Insider Threat Podcast. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different than usual. Typically, I'm the one grilling people and asking questions, but Adam, in honor of our 8.1 release, which is on the cusp of coming out, wants to ask me some questions. So I'm going to let him do that, and I'll be the answerer. So Adam, take us away.
Great. It's really nice being on the other side of the mic here, Jonathan. So we'll jump right into it. I think there's one feature within this dot release of StealthAUDIT version 8.1 that's particularly interesting. And it's something that our customers...
There's not a whole bunch.
There's a lot of things, but I think the headliner here is something that our customers have been asking for quite some time, which is support for Microsoft SQL Server. And I'm interested from your perspective, Jonathan, how does this play in the world of insider threat? What applicability do you think it has there?
Well, it's funny. SQL Server has a really interesting relationship to security in general. A lot of people doing security today probably remember starting their careers in security somewhere around the advent of SQL Slammer back in 2003, when security was really being cut out and defined as a specific IT discipline. So you talk about SQL Server security, that gets people's attention. But what's interesting too is that just like SQL Slammer is something that's not as common today, and I don't mean just that, but that kind of attack, because the platform vendors are doing better at not having buffer overflows and the silly stuff in their software. Not that they're not there, they're not perfect, but they're better. And so the kind of attacks you do see are credential-based attacks and things that really do use these insider threat angles. Or my favorite pet peeve is how they talk about these outside attacks that really are outsiders becoming insiders, and then essentially being an insider threat, just sort of skipping over the whole point that, yeah, it was somebody from the outside the organization, but really they got inside. So the ability to see where you have weak security configuration, especially around credentials on SQL Server platform and all the platforms, but on SQL Server specifically, yeah, that has real relevance. And this is exactly the kind of thing that the bad guys are attacking right now. So when you hear about these huge breaches where tons of records are stolen, it's not just the unstructured data, it's the structured data too, right? So, and they're getting to that by essentially hijacking credentials through weakly configured SQL servers. And SQL Server in particular, by the way, can be a really good angle of attack. I mean, it's why we decided to start there for a lot of reasons, right? We've had that conversation. But it's something that doesn't get as much attention in organizations. And you've got these huge DBA groups with specific security disciplines at these large organizations that focus on Oracle, or even like Sybase or HANA, or like all these crazy database platforms that people think of running these really gigantic transactional systems. But SQL Server is doing some pretty heavy lifting inside these organizations, but tends to still fly under the radar somehow, which is mystifying to me. But I think that there's been a lot of activity around it recently, so we're going to see a lot of people who are going to be very relieved that we got these features into the release. So yeah, I think it's very.
And I should have mentioned up front, we added platform support for Microsoft SQL Server. We added it to our data access governance suite, which means that we're really focused on understanding access to these databases, where sensitive data exists, and we're performing sensitive data discovery types routines. We're also doing activity monitoring here to see who's interacting with that sensitive data and just with the databases otherwise. And two of the things that I think really spurred us to do this, outside of the fact that customers really asking us for it, was one, like you mentioned, there's a lot of sensitive data contained within these databases. But number two, the proliferation of SQL databases across organizations is rampant, right? We see SQL all over the place, SQL Express, just instances of SQL popping up all over the place outside of these, big massive farms that you talk about. That's something I think we're going to really help with, and I think relates back to the insider threat piece of the equation as well by just understanding your footprint and where the most sensitive data resides. With those two pieces of information, at your disposal, you can really do a lot more to protect that type of data.
You can't protect something you don't know exists.
Exactly. So moving on, because there are a bunch of different things here in the release. Again, I thought, that's the headliner there for us, but I think there's a couple really cool things outside of that. The next piece I wanted to talk to you about is our AD weak password detection capabilities. Maybe, I could certainly go through what that's all about, but maybe you can educate everybody a little bit about what the whole solution's about and why, again, it's applicable to the insider threat scenario.
Well, I mean, it goes right back to the same thing we were just talking about for SQL Server, right? Weak credentials are the #1 angle for attack. And whether it's an insider, a true insider, who is using a weakly configured credential because they're trying to commit espionage, or leaving a little present before they leave after being fired, or something along those lines, or it again is that outsider pretending to be an insider through some hijacking technique. A weakly configured credential is going to be the thing that they're after, and the thing that's going to give them bad power. And really, the weak password protection that we've put into 8.1, it's exactly what the box advertises. We go through, we look at the configuration of the passwords in the directory, and we're going to be able to say where you have weakly configured passwords, basically where they are not meeting good policies, and maybe not even meeting your policies. And so, give you places to focus in terms of, where's the heat map of what I should be worried about from a credential perspective. And what I think is interesting is that, when we've been using this in testing and such, what becomes apparent, and this is not really a surprise to a security pro, right? But, I think it's going to surprise some people for sure. A lot of the most critical accounts tend to also be the ones that have very weakly configured passwords, because you get service accounts, especially, things that are being used for applications where, for whatever reason, sometimes because the application is just not mature enough to handle anything but a weak password, these service accounts have really weak passwords. They have passwords that are configured not to have really high levels of encryption. They're not very complex because maybe they can't be. And the other thing too is a lot of times these are shared accounts, and if they don't have a vault, which they really should, right? It's a whole other conversation. But if they don't have a vault, shared accounts tend to go towards less complex passwords because you've got a whole bunch of people who all need to remember them. And people will argue and say to you, like, you'll hear people say, well, all these people have to remember this password. It's got to be really simple. It's like, that's the opposite of the truth. Like, if all these people need access to this credential and they all have to use it, the more complex it needs to be, because that means that it is, a big risk, right? So one of the things that, I expect to see people doing is using this as fodder to feed vaults, like as a hit list, right? And it's funny that we didn't only just look at the weak passwords, right? We also did the fine-grained password policy stuff, right? Which you got to be at the pretty modern version of AD to take advantage of that. But this is where Microsoft is trying to do better at giving people tools to be able to control what passwords have what good settings. And it's yet another great feature in the Microsoft universe that people aren't always taking advantage of, and we're going to highlight where people can do that, right? So sort of the two ends of the stick here, the carrot and the stick, I should say, right, is here's some weak passwords, here's some places where you could be doing better with these passwords and still benefiting, and hopefully they'll also take all of that and feed it into the vault.
Yeah. And not to be overlooked here, outside of looking at password policy and configuration, we're also using published dictionaries of password hashes and looking to see whether or not any of the accounts inside of the environments are leveraging those same passwords, which allows us to basically create a heat map of those accounts which could be much more easily compromised versus others. And the interesting scenario there, I think, is that even if a password meets very strict complexity requirements, does not mean it's necessarily not weak, right? And so being able to go and eradicate those from the environment themselves really just makes it much more difficult for attackers to perpetrate the types of attacks that we're seeing out there in the wild, right? And it's about putting up roadblocks, right? The more mitigations we can put in place, the more difficult we can make it for attackers to do things that are otherwise quite simple to do, the greater the chances that we'll thwart those attacks or make them do something that, alerts others to their presence much quicker in the attack life cycle, right?
Or just exhausts them, right? I mean, sometimes you win the battle just by staying in the race longer than the other dude, right? And if the bad guy comes in and they try all the typical tricks and try to use all the typical tools, and they've got all this power sploit goodness that they're trying out, and it's not working, they're going to move on to an easier target, right? It's really about being a other target. That's what it's all about. There's the train going by.
Coming through here, so hang tight. We've got only one
engine. Okay. So for those of you who don't know, StealthAUDIT headquarters is right next to a freight train line. And which train is that? The Susquehanna, I bet?
The Susquehanna Railroad, yeah.
There you go. All right. So if you've seen these podcasts, you've probably been treated to the trade before.
Yeah.
Now that it's gone, though, what's the next and last question? We gotta wrap this up.
Yeah. So you alluded to it maybe by accident in your last response, where you talk about fine-grained password policies, which is one of a series of additional threat reports that we've added in, focused around Active Directory and Windows. I was curious, outside of fine-grained password policies, were there any others in the set that you thought particularly interesting?
Oh yeah, no, there's two that I think are really interesting. One for old reasons and one for new reasons. The one for old reasons would be the act as operating system detection, which this is one where if you've been installing software in Microsoft platforms long enough, you know that there's a lot of stuff out there that has just built up organically, assigned this right to act as the operating system. And really, this is just defaulting you as a local admin. That's really what it makes down to. It makes you system, it makes you even worse than that in a sense. But the point is, it makes whatever account has that right very dangerous. But it also can be very good for an attacker, in the sense that if they find one of these accounts, those accounts may not have that much attention. And also, it's one of those things that builds up as technical debt on systems, where maybe the server that you're talking about, especially if it's a physical box, it's been around for a while, maybe it used to be purposed for one type of application, and now one of the applications on it has been decommissioned for whatever reason. It's still serving all these other purposes, but decommissioned. But how much you want to bet that there are, again, service/application accounts that are on that system, probably configured with this right, waiting to be the angle of attack that somebody uses, right? So going out there, finding all this stuff, cleaning up the ones that are just not connected to anything else. They're just, basically disconnected phones sitting there. It's a weird analogy. I guess it's not really much like a phone, but you get what I'm saying. Just sitting there waiting to be cleaned up. That's a good thing to do, right? That's a hygiene thing. But then the one for new reasons, we're also going out and looking for the domain level replication stuff, the settings to be able to allow domain level replication. Now, it is really rare to have a good reason to give someone permission to do domain level replication. But it happens, and that's why permissions exist. That's why it is allowed. But if you're up to date with the latest pen testing techniques, you've got a tool out there called Mimikatz, which can make it really easy, if you can capture the permissions to do this domain level replication, to essentially scrape the entire directory for passwords. And by the way, tons of other information, with the passwords probably being the most dangerous. And that's just nasty stuff. You don't want to be vulnerable to that. So being able to go through and find, again, where these permissions have been granted, maybe even by accident, by giving away some group membership, or perhaps even giving a whole bunch of permissions in a group, and nobody's really paying attention to this one box that was also checked. Again, it's a hygiene thing to make sure you're a harder target, to make sure that the easiest thing that they can do, if they get mimikatz on there, it's the first thing I would try. Like, if I'm going to try to do the domain sync, it's the easy button to get everything. And that doesn't work. Now I got to work a little harder. Maybe I don't care anymore. Maybe I got another one I got to hit on, right? So they might move on, right? So again, it's one of those things. So those are the two I'd pick out. There's a whole bunch of them, right? But it would be the act as operating system and the domain level application.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of them added to a list of a whole bunch of others that have been quite eye-opening in accounts that I've worked with. At least I was on a call the other day. We found 14 clear text passwords stored in sysvol that were accessible read-only. And they're in there because they're running logon scripts and those types of things. And typically, if that's happening, you've got some sort of elevated account tied to it. You've got the password in plain text for a.
What happens in organizations is you get these crossovers where the server guy's like, okay, well, I don't have to worry about putting this password over here because I'm protected by the file system, and the network guy is doing everything right. And the file system guy is like, well, I don't have to worry about this part of the file system because the network guy is protecting me and the OS guy is probably doing everything right. And eventually those Venn diagrams start leaving a lot of holes where things can go wrong. And that's really what this is all about, right? Is trying to bring it all together and cover the whole threat surface in the world of inside of threat.
And I think, one last piece to that I think is really important. The point of this particular set of reports is to help identify areas for quick wins, right? We can go out there with these types of checks and say, here's a vulnerability that's easily fixed. Let's go and reduce our threat surface by doing some proactive hunting across the environment for areas of improvement.
Cool. Yeah. Well, all right. Usually I thank the guests for all of their input, although actually, Adam, even in asking the questions, you had a lot of good input. So I will thank you for your input today.
Thank you as well, Jonathan.
I
wanted to avoid you having to thank yourself.
Yeah, that's true. That would be, well, you know what? I would do it, so that's okay. Couple of things before we wrap up. Number one, if you're really interested in the threats against SQL Server, we're about to do a blog series on threats against SQL in particular, in the same style that we've been doing with file system attacks and AD attacks. So look out for that. And of course, as always, if you want to learn more, it's StealthBits.com, and there's plenty to learn. Until then, this is Jonathan Sander and Adam Laub signing off. We'll see you next time.